Hello, viewers, and welcome to Amateur Hour with me, Ben, the Amateur Exegete. Today is Saturday, September 18th, and on today's episode, I'll be playing for you my interview of Mark Edward about the Book of Revelation. Before we get to that interview, let me just briefly talk about what's been going on in my world. So, what's been going on in the world of the Amateur Exegete? First, if you've not paid attention, this is episode 5 of Amateur Hour, which means that there are 4 earlier episodes that you can watch if you haven't had a chance to. I've interviewed the non-alchemist on inerrancy, Cameron Razuric on Christadelphian Christology, Jackson Wheat on the problems with creationism, and Mira Scriptura on mirror reading. Even if no one else enjoyed watching these videos, I enjoyed conducting them, and learned quite a bit. Please, check them out. Second, on the 1st of this month, I published my review of L. Michael White's 2010 volume, Scripting Jesus, The Gospels in Rewrite. I've now read White's book at least 3 times, and my hope is that by writing a review of it, both of my readers would become aware of it and want to read it too. While it's fun to point out contradictions in the Gospels, it's even more fun to know why they are there in the first place. White's book is the place to go to find that out. Third, earlier this week, the first episode of Bible Study for Amateurs dropped. I've mentioned it in previous episodes of Amateur Hour, and it's finally here. If you've not been able to listen to it yet, please give it a whirl whenever you can make the time. Fourth, next week, the next entry in the Invasion of the Bible Snatchers series will be posted to my website. Over the next few months, I'll be closing out my discussion of Ray Comfort's book, Scientific Facts in the Bible. Check out the website this Monday. Finally, on the 4th of this month, I posted The Roundup, a collection of links to things I've enjoyed over the last month or so. This is similar to the weekly roundup that I used to do and retired because I was feeling overwhelmed. I'm hoping this new iteration will be useful to readers and will get the work of lesser-known bloggers, podcasters, and YouTubers out to my audience. A few weeks ago, I asked Mark Edward to come on my show. For those who don't know, Edward is a blogger who has written prolifically on a number of issues related to biblical studies. His website, which is linked to in the video description, contains pieces on polytheism in the Hebrew Scriptures, the deaths, plural, of Goliath, the transfiguration of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, and much more. Initially, I had asked him to come on to talk about 2 things, Pauline Christology and the Book of Revelation, but the more I read and reread the topics that he had written about, specifically on those 2 subjects, the more I realized that we would probably have to stick to one or the other. And so I asked Edward if he'd be willing to just talk about the Book of Revelation, and he graciously agreed. As you'll see, Edward knows his stuff. He's very competent, a clear thinker, and just an effective communicator. So, without further ado, here is my interview of Mark Edward.
In general, we would divide apocalypses into 2 categories, like subcategories. One would be cosmological, where the anonymous author is taken on a tour in his fictionalized visions through the cosmos. He sees hidden places where weather originates or where the afterlife is. He sees God's throne in heaven and the angels that attend to him. The other category we would call eschatological, which is events concerning the end times leading up to the end of the world, the climax of history and the grand finale, the final judgment, and all these things that most people tend to think of when they hear the word apocalypse.
For today's episode of Amateur Hour, I have the privilege of interviewing Mark Edward. So, Mark, if you don't mind, please just take a moment and introduce yourself.
Well, thanks for having me on. I am an amateur academic, armchair academic. I was raised a Christian for my entire life, and as an early teenager, I started getting really deep into wanting to learn theology and understanding everything I could about the religion I was being raised in, and got really deep into apologetics, at a young age, which I'm sure is probably a story for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Got into it really far in message boards, internet forums, and after a while, the more I dug into these apologetic books like Josh McDowell and Ray Comfort, the more dissatisfied I got with it. The more, just over time, it felt very disingenuous to me. Like I could, as a very, very devout, hyper fundamentalist Pentecostal, it was really easy for me to see these guys were not being charitable with the opposing side, and they weren't being completely honest with the evidence for their side.
Yeah.
And even though by this young age, I had a pretty vast knowledge of the theology and apologetics for my own bubble, it just wasn't a very satisfactory feeling to have that.
Yeah.
And, I grew up, go to college, and I took a lot of elective religion courses. And once you see the pieces start to get put together in a way that you'd never been taught, it's like it became very engaging and intriguing for me, which just kind of developed into a permanent hobby of mine to study this stuff from an academic perspective and not be caught up in following whatever I already believed, as my conclusion and finding the evidence to fit it. Starting from the beginning instead of from the end.
Yeah. Did you go to a secular school that had religious studies, or did you go to a religious school that had, how was that like?
I looked into going to a Bible college in my state, and I ended up going to a public university, state university that had a really solid religion and philosophy department. One of my professors was Kenneth Atkinson, who worked on the what's it called? The New English Translation of the Septuagint.
Oh yeah,
he was one of their translators.
Yeah, I use that quite frequently. Wow, okay, that is very interesting.
So he was an amazing professor. His classes are what got me hooked onto academic biblical studies.
Wow, I'm a little jealous, a little bit. Just not a whole lot, man. Wow. So you've got a religious background. So your story does sound a lot like many people that I come across. I'm almost 40. I don't know how old you are, but a lot of the people in my generations, especially who have become skeptics or atheists or whatever, kind of have this background where they engaged with apologetic literature, but it just didn't feed them. It didn't satisfy them. So it's very interesting that you have that kind of a background too.
Yeah.
So let's kind of talk about your website, because what you're, at least for me, what you're known for is your websites on biblical studies, your website, and you cover all these topics, the deaths of Goliath, Melchizedek. You've got posts on the book of Daniel, like the 70 weeks. What was the impetus for that website? Because you have it's a very neat website. It's very clean. It's very well put together. What drove you to create this website, and how long has it been up?
I've been dabbling with, Bible blog type stuff for maybe about a decade, but like what I have now, I've had up for about 2 or 3 years. And I've tried really hard to make it as clean, simple, and straightforward as I can, just to communicate what I find when I study this stuff. So the goal was I have conversations with friends, Christian friends who go to church, agnostic friends, secular friends of all kinds, and sometimes they'll ask, like, what do you think about this topic? What do you think about this weird little passage in the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it gets me digging. Like their question is something I'd never thought about. I think one of the oldest pieces on my website right now is about Balaam, the prophet. And I think I wrote that in about 2014 when a friend of mine who was doing the Bible in a Year project got to that passage, and he just immediately noticed this little narrative contradiction in the space of about 3 sentences. And I had never noticed that before. And so when I dug into it, it became this larger study. And just from then on, anytime I have these questions or friends of mine have questions, I'll look into it. And if it's, if I enjoy what I'm finding, and if I find it really engaging, I'll start to write down notes and type it up eventually. And if I think it's worth it, I'll put it on my website to share with just whoever wants to read it.
Yeah. How long does it take you from beginning to end, usually, like the average post to write?
Probably average would take about 2 weeks. Maybe a little bit longer, a little bit less, depending on the Balaam one wasn't terribly in depth. It was one of the earliest ones, but then I had a more recent one on the character of Melchizedek, and that took me about 2.5 weeks, just trying to find literature, find textbooks or commentaries or articles that just weren't repeating the same information. They weren't just giving the same spiel. They were giving something new to find.
No, that makes sense. Because your posts are very well organized. They're easy to follow. And for me as a reader, that makes it just easy to follow, easy to figure out what you're trying to say. I'm a little envious of your style. Because often I'm just all over the place. I don't outline. Do you outline your posts at all? And you kind of have an outline. Yeah. You kind of have an outline because the way you set it up. So I really enjoy them.
The drafting process in the Google Doc is about 3 or 4 days of just typing and then going back through and reorganizing and fixing it. Sometimes I'll take a whole section and just move it around to get it in the right spot for a good flow.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's move on to the next question. Of all the posts that you've written, and you've written quite a few, what do you think? Which are maybe your couple your favorite pieces that you've written? The ones you enjoyed the most to write.
Yeah, probably the ones that I learned something I completely did not expect. So, for example, one of the posts is on King Saul, and I didn't even this was a weird topic for me to go down. I normally don't care much for the genealogy stuff, but I saw this obscure paragraph about Saul's family in 1 Samuel 15, 14, something like that. It just interrupts the narrative, and it talks about, here's his family. And I'm like, this is weirdly placed. Why is this here? And as I'm studying it, I didn't really find anything I didn't anticipate finding. Different sources, kind of contradictory. They fit a little bit together, but not quite.
Yeah.
So that one was fun, but I wouldn't call it like a favorite. The ones that I enjoy most were probably ones like Jesus's transfiguration.
Okay. Yeah.
Where it surprised me how much it delved into eschatology of the time period. I just didn't see that coming. Or Matthew's infancy narrative, where we all know about how he uses his Isaiah 7:14, Emmanuel. But I had never heard that this story in Matthew was probably a pre-existing text that the author used. I didn't see that coming. I didn't realize that was there was evidence for something like that.
Very interesting.
So posts like that are the ones that I enjoy the most, just because, wow, I found something really, really interesting, brand new to me. Most people have probably never heard of this before. I think they would like to read that too.
Yeah. A related question, I don't have it listed here, but do you find that most of your audience, at least anyone that interacts with your stuff, is more
I guess the word maybe in tune with the academic flavor, like or do you get like fundamentalists who come in? Do you know anything about your audience? Do you pay attention? Maybe you don't even pay attention.
Not a lot. I have comments enabled on my website, but I don't generally get them. One person that I know reads it is a very devout Christian. He's the friend who asked about Balaam. He's kind of a distant enthusiast of the academic scene, but he doesn't like try to keep up with it. For him, it's more of a curiosity. I know one of my old pastors has dropped in from time to time. He's a very hardcore fundamentalist who thinks that it is a lie from Satan that Mark was written before Matthew. So that's always I know he doesn't comment, but I know he has some very strong negative opinions about what I write.
Wow.
But I have a lot of other people I know that are more in tune with it, like you or me, or maybe not. I think I had James McGrath drop in once and leave a comment.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I like Dr. McGrath. He's a nice guy, real smart. So let's talk about what I really wanted to have you on to talk about, which is the Book of Revelation, or as I hear it frequently, the Book of Revelations. So what do you think it is about this particular work that makes it just so popular among Christians? Well, among just about anybody, actually.
Yeah. I think other than the character of Jesus himself, Revelation is what readers are most able to find what they want to find. What they can mirror their personality in this book.
Okay, yeah.
If you ask a person what they think about Jesus, they're going to kind of give an idea of him that's fairly in tune with what kind of person they are. If they're a pacifist, they're going to find a pacifist Jesus, for example. So Revelation as a whole book is really ripe for that kind of alternate interpretation between different people. For people who want to find hope, they're going to find hope in it, vindication or elitism of some kind. That's very common. And especially today, at least in the United States, it's a very easy to abuse book for whatever theological position you want to take, especially within more millenarian Christians who everything in the world is a sign of the end times to them. So they see themselves as the heroes of this book, and they see it being fulfilled in front of them. They want to oppose whatever major social progress that they think they're a victim of.
Yeah.
And they see that in the book and being fulfilled, that they want to be on the right side of this story.
Yeah, I think, talking about the images of Jesus from the beginning of the book, you have this kind of authoritative, he's very godlike image of Jesus. But later in the book, you have the lamb that was slain. So it's very much a passive Jesus who has violence done to him rather than is doing violence. But then you get to the end of the book and it's the word of God proceeding from his mouth.
Messiah.
Exactly. Yeah. So you have these very, very different images of Jesus in this one single book. So let's talk about the book itself. Who wrote this work, and when did they write it?
The traditional answer for hundreds of years is that John, son of Zebedee, one of the 12 apostles, was the author, and he was the only of the 12 who was not martyred. He lived until about 100 CE, and he wrote the book around 95 CE. That's the common answer. There is a small minority of Christians who think the book was written around 67, 68 CE. Okay. And they come to this conclusion primarily for theological reasons. They think the whole book is concerned with the fall of Jerusalem in 70. So they, of course, have to find the book being written before that.
Are you talking about preterists? Are these?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
The vast majority of critical scholars agree that John, son of Zebedee, is not the author. It was either an anonymous person who took the name John as a pseudonym, or it was just an otherwise unknown person named John. And definitely not the same author as the Gospel of John or the Epistles of John.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say most scholars also take the book to around 90, 95 CE, but there are quite a few who see it as borrowing from traditions, maybe even literary sources that go back before the war against Rome in 70 CE.
Okay.
In my opinion, and a handful of scholars like David Ahn, there are more than one literary pieces in the Book of Revelation, so it was not written all in one time.
Okay.
So, for example, David Ahn would say that it was written across about 20 to 30 years by one author, but he was taking separate little tract dates he had written at different times for different occasions and just kind of combining them into a larger work. Not haphazardly, but they were not meant to be read as a narrative whole to begin with, and he's kind of forcing them to be that.
Okay.
My own theory is that we have 3 separate authors in Revelation.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
One of them, perhaps named John, was a Jewish follower of Jesus. And from him, we get these sections where we see a vision of the Lamb, the 7 bowls, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the great white throne judgment. And then the other primary author would be a Jewish not follower of Jesus, who wrote around 90, 95 CE. And that's where we get the visions of the dragon, the woman, the prostitute Babylon, the 2 beasts.
Huh.
And then a Christian redactor combined these 2 works together and turned it into an epistle. That's what my personal opinion is. That's
interesting.
There's some precedent for this in scholars, but it's not terribly common.
Huh. Yeah, because what you're proposing then is just, I mean, I don't think I've ever heard this before. So let me just make sure I get it right. There's a layer that is a Jewish follower of Jesus. And by follower of Jesus, you don't mean he was a literal disciple of Jesus from the early 1st century, but he was just a later follower of Jesus, right? It's like 2nd generation.
Sometime between maybe 60 and 90 CE.
Okay. So you have another author. Now, is this author who's not a Christian, not a follower of Jesus, is he working around the same time? Like
probably a little bit later, based on what I can tell.
Okay. And so he's writing these sections you mentioned, the story of the dragon from chapter 12.
Yeah.
And then a later redactor. Now, how late is this redactor working?
From what I can tell, based on my very amateur interpretation, probably 5 to 10 years after the second of those 2 sources was written. Like, he got to it pretty soon, and he had this other one ready to go, and he combined them.
Very interesting. Wow. That's a lot to chew on there. Because now I want to go back and read Revelation 12 as if it was written by someone who was not a believer in Jesus.
Yeah.
Like taking off the parts that are obviously Christological, but
the piece that convinced me of this, of that part of this book was not written by a Christian, was reading 2 contemporary apocalypses, which we can get into in a minute. One of them named 4th Ezra, and the other one named 2nd Baruch.
Mm-hmm.
And those 2 apocalypses were each written around 95, 100 CE. Both were reflections on the fall of Jerusalem to Rome, which they codenamed Babylon.
Mm-hmm.
And they each have a very similar program of like series of events that they expect to take place in the end times. And when you compare them, they're not identical, but they're very, very similar. That these 2 authors, 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, if they're not from the same community of Jewish apocalypticists, they are still working from very, very similar wells of thought. Okay. And I see a lot of that similarity in these other parts of Revelation. But the piece that tips it off to me, that convinces me of this idea that half of this book was not written by a Christian, is in Revelation 12, when we have the vision of the dragon and the woman gives birth to the Messiah. Mm-hmm. It never says he's crucified. It says
that's true.
He is born and he's immediately taken to heaven to be hidden away with God, and then the woman is taken somewhere on earth to be protected. But the child, the Messiah child, is never crucified. There's no hint he suffers in any way. And this idea of the Messiah being hidden in heaven, we find the same thing in 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, as well as some other apocalypses.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so that's a little bit mind-blowing to me. That's a little bit paradigm shifting for me, because I'm looking at Revelation 12 now, and if you start taking out like the end of the chapter where he talks about those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus, and there's a little song there in heaven, or a voice in heaven proclaiming about the Lamb. But even then, it's not. I don't think it's. Well, he does mention the Messiah, but it's not obviously Jesus necessarily.
Right. So that song, for example, or proclamation might be a better term, where it's declaring, the dragon sees his time is short, victory to those who are saved by the blood of the Lamb. That would be an interpolation from the redactor. He's inserting this to Christianize it, or he's adding that statement at the end of the chapter, and the witnesses of Jesus. You can easily remove that. The chapter makes sense, and it makes sense as a Jewish apocalypse.
Okay. I mean, I'm making notes like crazy on this, because this is just absolutely fascinating. Wow. So two authors, one redactor, and I'm gonna have to reread Revelation now. Thank you for that. That is insane. Well, okay. So next question. This is probably the heart of the conversation. So the book of Revelation is often referred to as the Apocalypse of John.
Mm-hmm.
What in the world is an apocalypse, and how does the book of Revelation fit into this, I guess, category or genre?
Yeah. Well, apocalypse comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which literally does mean revelation. Mm-hmm. It refers to the revealing or unveiling or uncovering, whatever your preferred translation is, of information that had been divinely hidden or preserved until the right time to tell mortals. So, for example, Paul, who we would consider an apocalypticist, although he did not write an apocalypse.
Yeah.
In Galatians 1, he says, I received the gospel through a revelation of Jesus the Messiah. That word revelation is apocalypse in Greek. God was pleased to reveal his son in me. Or Romans 16, he describes the gospel as the revelation of the mystery that was kept secret for long ages. That's a very succinct definition of what an apocalypse is for this time period. Mm-hmm. So an apocalypse as a book, as a genre, was meant to encapsulate a larger brand of this previously hidden, now revealed information from God. And we actually have quite a few examples of this genre other than the book of Revelation in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. In the Old Testament, the book of Daniel is an apocalypse. We have the very, very infamous First Enoch as an apocalypse, which is actually 5 or 6 separate apocalypses pieced together just over about 300 years.
Yeah.
4th Ezra, I mentioned, was an apocalypse written about the same time as Revelation. And an example of another Christian one would be the Shepherd of Hermas, written about 100 to 125 CE.
Okay.
So the genre, like any genre, employs its unique conventions or tropes. So, for example, almost all apocalypses that we know of, other than maybe 1 or 2, are pseudepigraphical, meaning they were written by somebody under a false name. In my opinion, this was originally not necessarily meant to deceive the readers. It was just such a widespread convention.
Yeah.
How did every author know to do it unless they knew it was a literary device? Yeah. So, for example, in 4th Ezra, the book is written about 100 CE, but it claims to be written by Ezra, who lived about 600 years earlier.
Yeah, that's a pretty big gap in years there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the author, I don't think, was doing this to deceive his readers. He was doing it the same way, not exactly the same way, but a parallel would be a fictional diary written let's say by George Washington, written 200 years later.
Yeah.
People find it in their bookstore. They know it's not George Washington's real diary, but it's meant to like put them into a specific situation in their mind and make them think about something in a certain way. So for the author of Fourth Ezra, he is invoking Ezra because of his connection to Babylon and the Babylonian exile, to remind people, his readers, of that because of the recent destruction of Jerusalem by Rome, where Rome is now Babylon. Apocalypses also feature loads of symbolism, coded language, allegories. This is what makes the genre so confusing, and especially a book like Revelation.
Yeah, that's very true.
And in general, we would divide apocalypses into two categories, like subcategories. One would be cosmological, where the anonymous author is taken on a tour in his fictionalized visions through the cosmos. He sees hidden places where weather originates or where the afterlife is. He sees God's throne in heaven and the angels that attend to him. The other category we would call eschatological, which is events concerning the end times leading up to the end of the world, the climax of history and the grand finale, the final judgment, and all these things that most people tend to think of when they hear the word apocalypse.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
One important point to make about eschatological apocalypses is that even though they are commonly called prophecies, even by their authors, they should not be thought about in the same way as a book like Isaiah or Amos or Hosea, because they operate in a very different mindset. These earlier prophetic books are meant to be warnings, almost like political commentary, where they say, hey, if our country keeps pursuing this course of action, things are not going to go well for us. God's going to get mad. He's going to punish us for disobeying the covenant. But if we change our course, if we repent, he will relent from his punishment. Jeremiah 18 says it almost explicitly. If God says this of a nation, like if he says that he will destroy this nation for sin, but they change their mind, he will not punish them, or vice versa.
Yeah.
That God can change his mind in traditional prophecy. Whereas in apocalypses concerned with the end times, the end is preordained. The events that will get you there are going to happen no matter what.
Yeah. It's fixed. So, now let's go back to the division. So you've can cosmological apocalypses and eschatological, does there tend to be overlap between the two, like a kind of a blurring of the lines, as it were? Are there examples maybe where they're more separated? I know in Revelation, obviously, there's elements of both, right? It's obviously looking forward to the end. There's obviously this cosmological aspect to it. But these other examples, like Fourth Ezra, even the book of Daniel, do they fall neatly into one category or the other, or do we see kind of a consistent bleeding into one and over the other?
I think in the cases of Daniel and Fourth Ezra, they are very firmly focused on the end times, eschatology. Whereas a book like Shepherd of Hermas is almost an outlier in that it's not really concerned. It does talk about eschatology, but that's not the main focus of the whole book. And it has almost nothing to say of cosmology. But then you go to one of the earliest apocalypses we know of, which is First Enoch, or rather the first section of First Enoch, chapters 1 through 36. It doesn't appear to be focused with eschatology at all. It has Enoch being told about the flood and angels that sinned by mating with humans. And then he goes on this grand journey through the cosmos. Unless you dig through the allegorical layer of the book and you decipher these fallen angels as symbolism for maybe the Greeks invading Israel and bringing corrupting culture to the Israelites. Or perhaps they are priests intermarrying with pagans and corrupting the bloodline of priests. And then it becomes somewhat concerned with the end times, but not entirely, unless
Yeah.
you say that the flood is an allegory for the end times as a whole, which it probably is.
Okay. Huh.
There are other parts of First Enoch, such as the astronomical book or the Book of Luminaries, has almost nothing to say about the end times. It's almost entirely concerned with the arrangement of the sun and moon and stars and weather and how they move across the sky, and therefore how Israel should properly keep their calendar. And so they keep their festivals on the right days, which was a big debate at the time. Are we keeping the right calendar?
It sounds very mundane, but not at that time. It was important. Wow. Well, let me ask you this. So I don't think we've covered this. Can you give like a brief synopsis of the book? Just kind of explain, what it's about, why was it written? Just those kinds of questions. Because I think when we look at a big book, because Revelation's it's a lengthy book. I mean, it's 22 chapters. And there's a lot, like you were talking about the symbolic language. That's the one thing that trips everybody up when they read it. And it becomes very daunting, because if you don't understand how apocalyptic texts work, if you're not familiar with the Hebrew Bible at all, this is a book that's very difficult to read and understand. So if you don't mind, just give a brief synopsis. What's it about, and why in the world would anybody want to write something like this?
Yeah. Well, the easiest answer is he was totally on mushrooms. That is what I have had people tell me from across the religious spectrum: Christian, non-Christian, Jewish, just all across. Even a lot of Christians have told me that they think it is such an acid trip, they can't understand why it's in the Bible, even though they do believe it. So do we want a summary of the symbolism from beginning to end, or a summary of what the authors might be communicating with that symbolism?
I think that what the authors are trying to communicate, because I think that symbolism is kind of subsumed under that to a certain degree.
Yeah.
So what are the authors trying to tell us?
So if we're taking the book as a whole, which means we're taking it according to the redactor's understanding of this symbolism, he is using it as, well, this is the case with most of these types of apocalypses. He is using it as a criticism of the prevailing political powers of his time, which is the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
The redactor is the one who wrote most of chapters 1 through 3, where Jesus addresses the 7 churches. And each of these miniature epistles is not just criticizing or praising these 7 churches. It's really talking about the Christian culture and its relationship to the Roman Empire. So when it is talking about, for example, the throne of Satan in Pergamon, I think it's Pergamon, that may be a reference to a temple of the Roman religion in that city, or
like an imperial cult, or to a specific
the enforcement of worship of the Roman gods, which was politics for them. It wasn't a separate thing called religion.
Yeah.
He also mentions symbolically Balak and Balaam, probably also a reference to the Roman emperor Balak, and Balaam being the imperial cult, the enforcement of a false religion in his mind. As he continues through the book, most of these judgments that we see, such as in the 7 seals or the 7 trumpets, they're drawing on primarily from the Exodus and a lot of other very common judgment tropes that we find in the Hebrew Bible, or just in the region in general. It's not unique to just the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
To convey judgment on, quote, the world, which for him is the Roman world. As we get to the dragon empowers a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns and has many crowns and so on. And as the text describes, one of these heads is struck with a fatal wound almost to death, but then revives. And these 7 heads represent 7 kings. 5 of them died. 1 is now, another's going to come. He's talking about the Roman emperors. There's a lot of debate about which ones precisely he's referring to, but it's agreed that that's who he's talking about. And he's predicting that the Messiah, Jesus in his case, is going to soon return to bring judgment on the Roman Empire for its hand in persecuting Christians. or if you want to expand that, Jews as well, Israel as a whole.
Yeah.
And Babylon, as mentioned with 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, is a cipher for the Rome, the capital of the empire itself. So the city of Rome is going to be destroyed specifically. Almost all of the book is concerned with this context, not something thousands of years in the future, not something spread across history. He doesn't have this in mind. He doesn't see future lasting that long. For him, and he says this several times, the redactor spells out, it's going to happen soon. The end is near. Don't seal this book up because it's about to be fulfilled.
Yeah. And he has Jesus saying, I'm coming soon, a couple times. Yeah. This more evidence. Now, so let me ask you this. If this is written in response or redacted in response to Roman persecution, do you see this as happening under maybe an official imperial persecution? Because a lot of times Christians will bring this up where, like take, for example, 1 Thessalonians, where Paul talks to them about the trials they face. And a lot of people think, well, this is some kind of official persecution at, the behest of the Roman governors, when really probably it's just this local sporadic thing. But Revelation has this feel to it, like there's something much bigger going on. Like there's some major either political upheaval, something bigger is happening. Do you see that in the book? Is that in the background anywhere, or is he just raising sporadic persecution to a more, for lack of a better term, cosmological level?
I would say there is virtually no persecution that has happened yet in the author's time period. If we're talking about my theory of the 3 different authors, the earliest one, the Jewish Christian one, and I have to briefly pause and say I don't like phrasing it that way. Christianity did not exist yet. It was not a separate religion from Judaism.
Yeah.
A messianist Jew who follows Jesus. For him, he doesn't really allude to persecution at all other than the 5th seal when he sees martyrs in heaven. But for him, it's what we would call, for lack of a better term, mythological, meaning it hasn't happened in history. It's not historical, it's mythological.
Okay, yeah.
So for him, a persecution hasn't happened yet. For the Jewish author, the second one, he talks about Rome persecuting Israel or the holy ones. For him, persecution has happened in the shape of the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 73 CE.
Okay, yeah.
Which the largest part of that was the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. The Romans would consider that mere politics. They would not consider that systematic persecution of a minority. For the author, it was. When we get to the redactor around year 100, persecution still hasn't really happened in any systematic sense. When he is addressing these 7, with the 7 churches in the voice of Jesus, he's only able to name 1 martyr. He doesn't refer to crowds of Christians being rounded up. He refers to 1 person. And he doesn't even tell us what the circumstances of his death was.
Oh, yeah.
So for him, for the redactor, persecution is maybe just beginning, and perhaps only in Asia, or what we call Turkey now. This is almost in the time period of a persecution that we know starts to begin in the 2nd century in that region. Yeah. We have letters from Pliny the Younger, I believe, not the Elder, addressing Emperor Trajan. So this is very early in the 2nd century, about 110 CE. And Pliny writes to Trajan saying, hey, people in this area are accusing others of being Christians. We interrogate them. We compel them to give an offering to in the temples or to the statues of the gods or to you. And some of them do, some of them don't. I kill the ones who don't. Am I doing the right thing? Is this what we want to do? Because I'm not actively seeking these people out to attack them. I'm just dealing with them as they show up here and there. And Trajan writes back, you're doing fine. Just keep doing what you're doing. Like for Trajan, for Pliny, there is no targeted attack on Christians. That kind of thing wouldn't happen for several decades. It hadn't happened in the first century.
So let's go back to this the Antipas from Revelation chapter 2. The text says that I'll just read the verse. It says, this is Revelation chapter 2, verse 13. I know where you are living, where Satan's throne is, and you suggested that's part of the Roman cult, or at least
in some way,
yeah. Yet you were holding fast to my name, and you did not deny your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan lives. So when the text says where Satan lives, is he talking about Pergamum? Is he talking about the city they're in? Is he talking about maybe Rome itself? This is not on the list I gave you, but it just came to my head because, when you get to Revelation 12 and you see the dragon, who is Satan, he's obviously associated in some way with Rome itself, the city. At least that's the way I tend to read it. Is he saying that this witness was taken to Rome, or Rome killed him there, or what do you think about that passage? It's
more than likely, if this is a historical person, Antipas, and not an invention of the author, because it could be.
Yeah, that name means like against all. It sounds like a
standing against all opposition.
Yeah.
If it is a historical person, we could easily see it being a very, very early case of some kind of administrator like Pliny being confronted with this person who refuses to participate in the local manifestation of the imperial cult. That person refuses and is summarily executed for it.
Yeah, because
that
again,
would be the most that would take place here.
Yeah, you're placing the chapters, you said 1 through 3, this epistolary opening. That's the redactor's work. So you're talking 100 CE almost, which is close to the time of Pliny and Trajan. So yeah, that makes sense. And this paradigm that you've introduced to me is just it makes me rethink the way I'm reading Revelation, because when you read it, the documentary hypothesis for the Pentateuch, when you see these layers and you see it changes the way you read the story. Like, it just completely revolutionizes the way you look at it, because now you look for the seams, you look for, maybe the tiny little, the clues maybe in the text that say this was written at this time versus this time. Now it's the same thing with Revelation, because now this epistolary opening has moved what may have been an earlier what you've proposed, 2 accounts, to a later time period, and framed it so that it's this Christianized, for lack of a better term, text. And so I don't know. I'm just coming up with these things in my head as I talk to you that have just really, really changed just everything about these opening chapters and the ending. Because you said the ending of the book is also the redactor's work. Is that right?
Most of chapter 22. Excuse me. I think verse 6 through the end of chapter 22 would be almost entirely from the redactor. And this is not to say he wrote it in a vacuum. He wrote these sections, these bookends, based on the symbolism he's finding in these other 2 sources he's bringing together. That's why he mentions, the Satan's throne in Pergamon. He's basing that on the dragon, giving his throne to the beast in chapter 13.
Yeah, it's all connecting. Calling back to other passages. Wow. Okay, so we're just about out of time, and I want to ask more questions. Let's see. I don't want to do that one because that's that would take let's do it. Let's finish our conversation with this question, because I don't know about you, but when I was a teenager, I grew up on Left Behind. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Tim LaHaye, Jerry Jenkins, Left Behind. So, like earlier, you were talking about the wounded head of the dragon that it comes back to life. Well, this was Nikolai Carpathia in the story, right?
Oh yeah.
He gets killed. Satan possesses him. He comes back to life. So the Antichrist in that story is Nikolai Carpathia. The Antichrist for Martin Luther, many of the reformers, was the Pope, the papacy.
Yeah.
But who is the Antichrist? And who does it refer to? Where do we find the Antichrist in the book of Revelation? So what's going on there? Tell me.
Well, two-pronged answer, and I'll try to be as quick as I can. The Antichrist is not in Revelation. He is only found, or they are only found, in 1st and 2nd John. And that's only if you look in the New Testament. They are also mentioned in either Polycarp or the letters of Ignatius. I can't remember which because I get them mixed together. In 1st and 2nd John, Antichrist is who the author sees as any pseudo-Christian, primarily those who have some kind of early docetic Christology. They believe Jesus' physical body was an apparition. At least that's what he hints at in 1 John chapter 2 and chapter 4. The person that people normally call the Antichrist in the book of Revelation is more properly just called the beast, where the beast is, as a whole, representative of the Roman Empire of the author's time period. Not a revived Roman Empire of the far future, not anything that is in Rome, such as the Vatican, specifically the Roman Empire of the author's time period. The 7 heads of the beast are 7 different emperors. There's a disagreement about which ones, but we have a pretty good idea of the range he's thinking of. Specifically concluding somewhere around the time of Domitian, near the end of the 1st century. The biggest question is, obviously, what is the mark of the beast? And how does that tie into the beast's identity? Because you have all these theories, Nikolai Carpathia in Left Behind. I've heard a lot, it stands for the internet, WWW.
Yep.
Ronald Wilson Reagan, because his name is 6 letters for his 3 names. It's microchips in the COVID vaccine.
Yep.
None of these things match the details that John, or whoever the author was, gives in chapter 13, which is, it is the name of a man, it is the number of his name, and the name of the man is the number of the beast, or is the name of the beast. So the author is telling us that the beast is not just the Roman Empire as a whole. It's not just a group of emperors. It is one specific emperor. And the conclusion that most scholars have come to agree on, based on the description he gives of how the name, what the name is, what the number is, that it's a name, the number of a name, and the details he gives later on about 5 kings being dead, the 6th one is, and the 7th one is yet to come, and he'll rule for a little while, and the 8th is of the 7. When he says that the 8th is of the 7 and that it was and is not but will be, the general consensus is he's referring to something we call the Nero Redivivus legend, which is that when Nero Caesar died in 68 CE by suicide, it was commonly believed that he had actually escaped Rome. He ran away in hiding. And this rumor persisted for decades and became a spiritualized, apocalypticized myth. And it existed in different forms, but we have it in other texts. It's not just in Revelation. It's found in a collection of Jewish and Christian and a little bit Gnostic prophecies we call the Sibylline oracles. Really large series of prophecies. And it talks about all the emperors up till, I think, Septimus Severus. But whenever it talks about Nero, it singles him out as the worst of the bunch. And it keeps referring to him as the fugitive king because he allegedly ran away. And it says that he will one day return to either rule Rome or destroy it. So we have this legend in other books, not just Revelation. And Revelation just happens to be one of the earliest of the bunch. And it has the weird twist that Nero didn't run away, he died, or at least seemed to, because he is the head that was struck fatally. He was and is not, but will be. So the thing that convinces almost all scholars, critical scholars, that it's him specifically, or it's going to be a revived him or resurrected him, is the number of the beast or the number of his name, because it's this system that we call gematria or isopsephy. Gematria is the system where each letter of the alphabet has a numerical value. In Greek and Hebrew, it's 1 through 9, and then 10, 20, 30, and then 100, 200, 300, and so on. And as a result, since every name has a number equivalent by adding up what the letters equal, you can easily find Nero's name in 666. The question is it in Greek or is it in Hebrew? Because they each have it. The Revelation was written in Greek, but the author of this part of the book is a Jew who thinks in Hebrew. We have one other text from the time period that also uses gematria, where the book was written in Greek, but the author thought in Hebrew. And this is Third Baruch, not Second Baruch, the other apocalypse. Third Baruch talks about the flood. And it uniquely says that in the flood, 409,000 giants died. We don't get this number anywhere else in any other text.
Yeah,
so the question is, how did he come to this number 409,000? Even though Third Baruch was written in Greek, the author appears to have been thinking in Hebrew, because he took the Greek word for flood, cataclysmos, wrote it in Hebrew letters, and it equals 409.
Oh.
He does it in a separate part of his book where he talks about there being 360 rivers in the world. Where did he get this number? Well, he says that he connects these rivers to a serpent, or in Greek, drakon. We take drakon, write it in Hebrew, it equals 360. So even though this book was written in Greek and he's using Greek words, he's calculating the numeric value of these words in Hebrew. This is what we have happening in the book of Revelation, where the author is referring to Nero, Caesar. He's taking the Greek spelling of his name, but he's writing it in Hebrew characters, and it equals 666.
So he's transliterating the name. Is that what we're saying? Very interesting. Okay.
To add to the puzzle, just as a fun little side thing, he does the same thing for beast, which is therion. He takes therion, therion, puts it into Hebrew, and it also equals 666. So very literally, Nero Caesar equals beast.
That is interesting. I don't think I knew that.
So for the author, he gives this code, this gematria 666, and we know it's 666, not just 666.
Yeah, 66. Yeah.
That's an important distinction because people try to exploit it for all kinds of things. He gives this code to his readers. Maybe he expected Roman authorities to find his book and he wanted a little bit of leeway, but he's not unique in encoding an emperor's name through the number of their name. We find the same thing in the Sibylline oracles. All the emperors are referred to by the numeric value of the first letter of their name.
Okay.
So it just seems to be an apocalyptic convention that you generally don't refer to historical figures contemporary to you by their name. You use the number of their name, a way of distancing yourself from them in some way.
Yeah, it's kind of a protection. Wow, that's really interesting. Wow. Well, that actually covers two big questions that I really wanted to get into. So now you've nailed them both. So
excellent.
That kind of does it for our time. We missed a couple questions, but I can always, maybe I'll get you on here again sometime to talk more about Revelation. And I really want to talk to you about Pauline Christology too. But I'm kind of glad. That was my first thought. I was going to get you to do both. But the more I wrote the questions for Revelation, the more I thought there's no way we are going to be able to cover anything about Pauline Christology. There's just no way. Revelation is way too interesting. But so maybe sometime I can con you into coming on again to talk about that.
Sure. That'd be great.
So as we do close, just let everybody know where they can find you. Twitter, your website, anything else you want to plug. This is your chance to do that. So.
My website is bible.markedward.com, and my Twitter is also BibleMarkEdward. I'm not terribly active on there in writing my own things, but I, hit the little like button, retweet other people. Sometimes I'll chime in and respond to somebody about something, but it's not terribly common.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to include all that in the video description so people could just click on your stuff, go right to the post. And I will definitely include some of your posts on the Antichrist 666, 666. And also you wrote a really lengthy post on divine violence in the Book of Revelation, which is really a really interesting read. So I'll make sure to include that as well. So Mark, thank you so much for being willing to do this. You've blown my mind. I mean, I'm going to have to reread Revelation this week just to read it through the paradigm that you're suggesting, because I don't know. It's just, now that I think about the Book of Revelation, it's all I can think about is, oh my gosh, this part was not even written by somebody who believed in Jesus,
Yeah.
You might have ruined the book for me. I don't know. I may blame you for that.
I think it makes it better.
Yeah.
Source criticism, finding sources, is learning about sources in the Bible is a big hobby of mine.
Yeah. Well, I can tell because you put the work in. So, all right. Well, Mark, thank you again.
Thanks again.
If you didn't notice, there were moments where I kind of became quite flustered, but not because I disagreed with what I was hearing, but because there was just so much information at times. I was overwhelmed. After the show, Edward and I talked, and I told him that I needed to have him on again next year so we could dive into the subject of Pauline Christology, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to also ask more about his views on the Book of Revelation. In the meantime, check out the video description. There you'll find not only links to the material that I discussed at the beginning of the episode, like my review of L. Michael White's Scripting Jesus or the Roundup, but you'll also find links to Mark Edwards' website, his Twitter account, and a couple of articles that I think you might find helpful and interesting. If you haven't already, hit that like and subscribe button and feel free to share. And as always, if you want to support my work, just head over to amateurexegete.com and hit the support tab.